Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Apologies for the delay. We had some small hiccup just before we started, but I think everything is okay now. Today's webinar, this morning's webinar, in fact, is for CENELEC audience. So we're starting this morning with a webinar on drafting harmonized standards. It will go over more in particular through the Internal Regulations Part 3 and the rules, requirements, and normative references that you should all follow to avoid lack of compliance, of course. So, as said, this presentation is for CENELEC Technical Body Officers and standard drafters involved in drafting these harmonized standards. My name is Else, and I will be moderating the webinar in the background. As usual, you are all muted today, so you're not able to ask your question right away. But we do invite you to use the Q&A panel. The chat is disabled for all attendees, but you can use the Q&A panel to submit your questions, and the speakers will try to have a look at your questions as much as possible in the background. Should your question remain unreplied today, please don't worry, because we intend to make a report available via the website. As usual, you will be informed when that report is available. We are recording this webinar, so you will also be able to look back and share with colleagues should they be interested in this CENELEC webinar. Should you be on Twitter, please feel free to tweet. We have a hashtag training for standards, and CEN and CENELEC are available via the handle @standards4EU. So without further ado, please, I would like to introduce my two colleagues taking care of the presentation today. They're in fact sitting with me in the same room today. So please, Marlies and Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Els. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us in this webinar today. This is our agenda for today. We will start by explaining why we have organized this webinar. Then we will enter in the core of the webinar by discussing elements from Internal Regulations Part 3 related to drafting rules and requirements. And finally, another very important and core element, we will address the use of normative references. The goal of this webinar is to highlight some specific elements from Internal Regulations Part 3 that have shown to potentially lead to a lack of compliance HAS assessment if not taken care of correctly. Statistics have showed that few elements from Internal Regulations Part 3 can have a critical impact on the outcome of an assessment. We won't have time today to cover all the requirements from Internal Regulations Part 3, but we will instead focus on specific drafting rules identified as regularly giving troubles to standard drafters. So we will discuss the formulation of verifiable and unambiguous requirements, the neutrality principle, and we will end the webinar with the use of normative references. First, a few updates about the restart of the new HAS contract. So the HAS contractor and Ernst & Young started to process HAS assessment in mid-October. This means that the HAS consultants are now assessing draft harmonized standards, and some assessment reports have been made available. For the time being, the assessment reports will be anonymous in order to comply with the General Data Protection Regulation. So again, the first assessment reports are being received, and so the backlog is reducing. For more information about the new HAS contract, I invite you to register and join the webinar titled Restart of the HAS Assessment System. It's scheduled on the 5th of December, and the goals of this coming webinar will be to do a recap of the tasks and responsibilities of the HAS contractor and the consultants, to recap on the existing processes and flows, and to present the novelties of the HAS assessment system. You should have already received an evitation from mail training, you can as well find the webinar description as well as the registration link on the CENELEC experts area. Now let's highlight some rules and requirements from Internal Regulations Part 3 that, again, can have a critical impact on the outcome of the HAS assessment and thus the citation in the official journal. We will first see a reminder of the rules, and in a second step, we will see some real-world examples. So first, the reminders. Clause 4 of the Internal Regulations Part 3 gives the objectives of standardization. This clause states that the objective of a standard is to specify clear and unambiguous provisions. Clause 5.5 is about verifiability. Requirements shall be objectively verifiable. Statements that are subjective and/or leaving room for interpretation shall not be used. The last reminder for today is about the neutrality principle. Clauses dealing with conformity assessment should be written in a neutral way so that conformity can be assessed by anybody. Let's see now some real-world example. Let's start with standards identified as having issues with some requirements. So the first example was intended to be offered for citation in support of the low voltage directive. Clause 3.5.5 defines a protective impedance. It reads, impedance connected between hazardous live parts and accessible conductive parts of such value that the current in normal use and under likely fault conditions is limited to a safe value and which is so constructed that its ability is maintained throughout the life of the equipment. In the table of comments from the assessment report, the HAS consultant asked, what is a safe level? So this project received a lack of compliance assessment, and therefore it was not offered for citation. Another example from a different standard, clause 8.2.5.5 gives requirements about material of current carrying parts. Metals showing a great difference of electrochemical potential with respect to each other under moist condition shall not be used in contact with each other. In the table of comments from the assessment report, the HAS consultant asked to define what is a great difference. There again, the project received a lack of compliance assessment and therefore was not offered for citation. The two previous examples received lack of compliance assessment due to requirements that were not clear, more specifically, requirements having issues with verifiability. The two coming examples, on the other hand, have clear and verifiable requirements. This clause here, for example, has clear requirements about noise, where we can see that the sound pressure level is clearly defined with a numerical value. And as well, this clause has clear requirements about vibrations, where the vibration total value is clearly described as well. So this standard received a compliant assessment and was cited in the official journal in support of the machinery directive. This other example has clear and verifiable requirements about the way to measure the insulation resistance and the value that should be measured. As well, this project received a compliant assessment, and it was cited in the official journal in support of the low voltage directive. Now, let's briefly discuss about aspects of conformity assessment. As reminded earlier, clauses dealing with conformity assessment should be written in a neutral way, so that conformity assessment can be assessed by anybody. This clause does not respect the neutrality principle as it imposes obligations to the manufacturer. The same clause redrafted to comply with the neutrality principle would read that it shall be specifically ensured instead of the manufacturer shall specifically ensure. So this clause is redrafted to comply with the neutrality principle. Before moving to the part related to normative references, I would like to conclude this part of the webinar with some key takeaways. Clear and unambiguous provisions shall be specified. Requirements shall be objectively verifiable. And finally, clauses dealing with conformity assessment shall be written in a neutral way. As explained during the introduction, those elements were identified as having a not negligible impact on the outcome of the HAS assessment. Therefore, by paying attention to these rules and requirements, standard drafters will put themselves on the path to success. So I thank you again for your attention, and I will now leave the floor to Marlies for the part related to the normative references.
Thank you, Frédéric, and good morning, everyone. I am going to talk you through some rules and requirements on normative references in harmonized standards. I'm first going to provide some general guidance and discuss the rules we have on normative references for all standards. And then I'll continue with some specific guidance and rules for harmonized standards. As you will know, drafting rules for CEN and CENELEC documents are laid down in Internal Regulations Part 3, which you can find on CENELEC BOSS. And also on normative references, IR3 has some specific rules. The first relevant clause in IR3 relevant for normative references is clause 15, normative references. This clause tells us what clause 2 normative references is and what it is for. The normative references clause lists for information those documents which are cited in the text in such a way that some or all of their content constitutes requirements of the document. Information on how these references apply is found in the place where they are cited in the document, not in the normative references clause. So clause 2 is informative. It's a source of reference for the convenience of the user. How the references apply has to be defined in the body of the standard. So this means that clause 2 actually only reflects what is in the body of the text. A second clause in IR3 that is relevant for normative references is clause 10, referencing. This clause tells us which normative references are permitted, that normative references can be dated or undated, and reference is allowed or even mandatory. So these are your basic IR3 rules, which apply to all standards. For harmonized standards, there are some specific rules and European Commission requirements to take into account, which I will discuss now. The reference document for the European Commission is the Vademecum on European Standardization, which is a Commission staff working document of 2015. In its part 3, section 2A3, some guidance is provided on the use of normative references in harmonized standards. And what do you need to remember is that in harmonized standards, normative references can be harmonized standards or non-harmonized standards. Normative references should be dated, they should be active, and they should be published whenever the harmonized standard is adopted. So this means that a published harmonized standard should not have normative references to draft standards. There is an exception to this, but I will discuss this later on. So in other words, the last point on the slide here is that a harmonized standard should not contain normative references to standards that are outdated, withdrawn, or not publicly available. Whenever you are drafting a harmonized standard and you are including a normative reference, you should ask yourself the following question to know if European Commission requirements apply. The question is this normative reference included in a clause that is giving presumption of conformity? If the reply to that question is yes, then not only IR3 applies, but also the Commission requirements apply. If the answer is no, only IR3 applies. So the Commission asks that normative references are dated when they are linked to essential requirements of EU legislation to give presumption of conformity. Now, why is that? Normative references form an integral part of a harmonized standard, and standards are part of a legal system. So to provide legal certainty, normative references should be dated in harmonized standards. Furthermore, an undated normative reference creates a dynamic reference, which makes it difficult for the Commission to control, and so an undated normative reference actually creates a risk that the presumption of conformity is lost. Now, let's have a look at what this means in practice. I am now going to talk about homegrown standards first and give some examples. And then I'll go into parallel work, so standards developed under the Frankfurt Agreement. So as mentioned in the beginning, normative references should be dated in the body of the standard and in clause 2. So this example, which you see here on the slide, is wrong because the references have only been dated in clause 2 and not in the text. If you do this, this can lead to a negative assessment, and you see here an example of a has consulted comment saying that the normative references are dated only in clause 2, while in the normative text undated references are used. The correct way would be like this. So the references are dated in the body of the text, and as a result, they are also dated in clause 2. If we go a step further, a good practice would be to not only date the normative references, but also to specify the clause of that normative reference of that standard. This is clearer for the user and it adds to legal certainty. So if you do so, you get 3 thumbs up. I would like to draw your attention to I would like to ask you to be careful when you are drafting amendments. When you're drafting an amendment of a harmonized standard, you should review if in the harmonized standard that is being amended, the normative references are dated and active. If they are not, they should be dated in the amendment. So we have a good example here where the amendment actually replaced the entire clause 2. You do not necessarily have to replace the entire clause 2, but if, for example, you have only one normative reference in there that needs to be updated or dated, you can just do it for the one. But here is an example where the entire clause 2 was replaced. Another thing to keep in mind when you are drafting amendments is that when you are modifying a normative reference in the body of the text, this will mean you also will have to modify it in clause 2, since, as said before, clause 2 reflects what is in the body of the text. As we see in the example here, in the original standard, there is a paragraph with a normative reference. The amendment is modifying this clause and modifying the normative reference. The year has changed. This means you will also need a modification to clause 2, changing the same normative reference. So let's move on to ENIC standards, so standards developed under the Frankfurt Agreement. When you are dealing with a harmonized ENIC, you are supposed to date normative reference, but of course it's an ENIC, so you are not able to change the text of the international standard, unless of course through common modifications. However, if you only have to date normative references, you do not need common modifications for that. You can simply do that through the Annex ZA. Here in the example, on the left side of this slide, we see the clause 2 of the IEC standard. On the right, you see the Annex ZA, which is a normative annex in the ENIC. And you see on the left side of the table in the Annex ZA, it is reflected what is in the clause 2 of the IEC standard. So for example, in the clause 2, you have your IEC 60423, 2007, and this is reflected in the left side of the column of the Annex ZA. You also see that any corrigenda amendments mentioned in the clause 2 are also added in the Annex ZA. So for example, you see there IEC 60529, 1989, and also the Amendment 1 and Amendment 2 is mentioned, so these are also listed in the Annex ZA. Now, on the right side of the table in the Annex ZA, any European equivalents need to be listed. So the Annex ZA lists any European equivalents which are to be used instead of the international standards. On the right side of this column, you will also list any corrigenda and amendments, for example, also A11s, A12s if they exist. And on the right side of this column, on the right side of this table in the Annex ZA, this is where you have to date the normative references. Now, if in the clause 2 of the IEC standard, a reference is not dated, you will also not date it in the Annex ZA on the left side. You will list it in the Annex ZA as not dated. And then if there is a European equivalent, you will add that on the right side of the column and you will date the European equivalent. Of course, second example, which you see on the slide, it may happen that a reference in the clause 2 of the IEC standard is not dated. However, there is no European equivalent, no European equivalent exists. In that case, you will date the IEC standard, so on the left side in the table, and add a footnote stating dated as no European equivalent exists, as you see there. In a similar way as I wanted to draw your attention earlier to drafting amendments, this also goes for ENICs, specifically for common modifications. When a common modification modifies, adds, or deletes a normative reference in the body of the text, this may have an impact on clause 2, and as a result, also on the Annex ZA. So as we see in the example here, the A11 is adding a clause that has a normative reference. This means that you will have to add this normative reference to clause 2. And as a result, you will also have to list this normative reference in the annex set A. So those were the most important rules to remember about the fact that normative references have to be dated in harmonized standards. So they can only be undated when the reference is informative, when the reference is normative but related to a clause in the harmonized standard that does not provide any legal effect. And exceptionally, but this is exceptional, undated normative references to give presumption of conformity are possible if the technical committee provides a very detailed justification. But please remember, this is not recommended. The default solution is to date the normative reference. So, as mentioned, not only do normative references need to be dated, they also need to be active and published at the time when the harmonized standard is published. The use of draft standards as normative references is exceptionally possible if being developed at the same stage. This means that in the draft harmonized standard you are working on, you can have normative references to draft standards. However, be careful. By the time the harmonized standard is published, the standards that are being referred to have to be published already, or they are being published at the same time. So when you have this exceptional case, to refer to a non-published standard, please use a long dash and a footnote, as we see there, to indicate that the standard is not yet published. So in the example here on the right, it's an example taken from IR3. And on the left, we have an example from an annex set A. So this long dash actually replaces the year or the date. What you could also do is actually write FPR-EN and then put a date. Right now you would probably put 2023, but do not forget the FPR part. Do not write EN and reference number and then a year, because that it will not be clear that this standard is not published yet. So either you use a long dash and a footnote, or you write FPR-EN and a year. Also, please do not leave the year blank, because that would mean it is undated. So either put a long dash or put FPR-EN and a year. So at the time of publication, of the harmonized standard, it would have to look like this, because the standard would have to be published already or being published at the same time. If the editor at publication stage finds a long dash and a footnote or FPR-EN and a year, we will update the reference if it has been published in the meantime or is to be published at the same time. Now, a couple of additional requirements to bear in mind for normative references. Normative references should be EN, ISO, IEC published standards. The use of non-EN, ISO, IEC standards can only be included with the agreement of the European Commission. This is exceptional, and you will have to provide an appropriate justification. And then, as explained before, no, this was not explained before, sorry. Non-EN, ISO, IEC standards can be used in clauses of the harmonized standard not giving presumption of conformity. but please be careful with this. So here we have a incorrect example because all of these references are non-EN, ISO, IEC standards. Another thing to bear in mind, please do not refer to series of standards. This goes for homegrown harmonized standards as well as for the Annex ZA in EN IECs. You can see there an example of a HAS consultant comment saying series of standards are not individually listed and dated. So for EN IEC harmonized standards, when the class 2 of an IEC standard refers to a series, please list and date the parts individually in the Annex ZA so that you can date everything. And then finally, please do not use normative references to technical reports and avoid normative references to technical specifications. And to sum up, here are some key learning points to take away. So your reference document on normative references is IR3. There are additional European Commission criteria to be followed. Normative references or the incorrect use of normative references is a common reason for lack of compliance assessment. The default solution is to date normative references. Normative references have to be dated, active, and published. There is some flexibility in case the reference is not linked to clauses giving presumption of conformity. And please be careful when you have normative references that are being developed at the same time as the harmonized standard. We have also added a slide that summarizes where you can find forms and templates and information that is essential when you are developing a harmonized standard. All of this can be found on CENELEC BOSS. And as a last point, I would also like to add that whenever you have doubts or questions, you can always contact CCMC in general or your technical PM, and we can assist you. And now I would like to thank you for listening, and I think we will have time for some questions.
Yes, thank you, Marlies and Frederick as well. I think we still have some moment here for questions. No questions came in while you were speaking, but I would like maybe to ask the attendees to still take a moment to enter their questions if they have one or two or even more, because we have planned to end this webinar around 11, so we still have time. I would like to maybe also already inform you that we're having a webinar with some more CEN specific rules at 11:30. So should you be working on both CEN and CENELEC level, you might be interested to follow that one as well. Also reminding you that we are recording this webinar, so the recording will be made available. I will send you an email later today with the link and also the presentation added to that email. So please feel free to enter your questions should you have questions. If not, I think everything was crystal clear. I think many examples were given, so that is usually very helpful, I think. While people are entering many questions at this moment, I would just like to remind the audience that we have some upcoming webinars as well. As mentioned already by Frederick, on the 5th of December, we have a webinar focusing on the restart of the HAS assessment system that might be very interesting for you. The other ones are listed here and can be accessed when you receive the presentation later today. Yes, there is one question of James Clark coming in. If there will be a link available for the CEN specific webinar later today, of course, that webinar will also be recorded. Our main rule is if you registered for that webinar, you will receive the link in your inbox, even if you don't show up. If you did not register, I would advise you to go on the website, on the CEN expert site in this case, to have a look and consult the recording over there. So some more questions coming. Marlies and Frederic, I'm looking at you to take care of these ones. Just give us a moment, please, to go through them. Okay, we have one question from Anthony. He's wondering what is the best place to find the status of harmonized standards, assuming that it would be projects. Frederic, can you clarify?
Yes, else. Indeed, thank you. Indeed, Anthony, the best place to find status of a harmonized standard is on projects online, where you have fields dedicated to the status of the project, and you can find information about the status of the harmonized standard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Frederic. Let's have a look at the other questions. Is there one that you want to take care of?
The question by Antonio Monaco.
Okay. So Antonio is asking if we make an amendment 11 for harmonization of an ENIC, do you always need to put the clause 2?
The answer is no. It will depend on your modifications to the text, which may have an impact on the clause 2, but if this is not the case, then no. And I can see Gonzalo would also like to answer this question live.
Yes, so for the audience, maybe Gonzalo is not sitting with us today, but he's connected, of course, also there to help us out answering as many questions as possible. Gonzalo, are you there?
So yes, I'm here, but I just clicked so that it was clear that was the answer that was being replied, and so you said everything, Marley.
Okay, thank you. Gonzalo, is there maybe another question that you can help us with?
I can go to the one from Fernando. So in terms of he's questioning about accessibility, which is not under the system, but that the Commission said that it could be. At the moment, Fernando, we don't have any information in this nature. The only thing we know is that there was a list of sectors covered in the system, and the Commission informed that this list can be extended. But of course, there will be a process for that. At the moment, there is no information whatsoever about this. However, if you talk about harmonized standards, whether they are under the system or not, it is highly recommended to follow the principles that we presented here today.
Okay, thank you, Gonzalo.
Maybe I can also take, there was another one.
Yeah, you just clicked it, so it moved to answered.
Sorry.
The one from Laurent Guillon,
yeah.
Right?
So yes, so I think you raised quite an interesting point, and I think this is also why what has been presented in how to deal with normative references. So we did have cases in the past where standards have not been cited because they were referring to harmonized standards not being cited in the official journal. However, if we have precise reference to other normative references, so for instance, if you refer to specific clauses, in this case, you can also reduce the risk of opening the scrutiny of this document. So very often when the standard is not cited is for some specific reason with this harmonized standard. If you focus your reference to a specific technical element, you are also reducing that risk. But of course, you know, it's always difficult to reply to this type of of question with very open and generic examples. So of course, if you have similar or specific cases, do not hesitate to liaise with your project manager or with the editor of the standard, so to clarify this type of situation.
Okay, thank you, Gonzalo. I'm heading back to Marlies and Frederick here. I see 4 questions still unreplied. Maybe it's also time to just remind the audience that if your question remains unreplied because time's up, we do intend to create a Q&A report. So you will be informed when the answer to your question is available online.
Else I can also try to reply the 2 questions from Richelieu.
Yes, of course.
It's a challenging question, but to a certain extent, I think we can give some advice on how to deal with this. For instance, in terms of exclusion of technology, the way to exclude technology or elements from the standard would be to define those in the scope as a first instance. And in terms of performance orientation of the standard, this means that we should have a standard that is defined in a way that you assess the performance of whatever characteristic it is. If you have a test method, if you have a way to calculate the performance, rather than being prescriptive. I think this is in a generic way the simplest way to describe it. And I think we should also be very careful with the exclusion of technology. And this is a question that is very closely oriented to the scope of the standards. Because if you say that imagine we are dealing with a washing machine, and if you don't exclude in the scope any type of washing machine, so you should not try to avoid or to exclude certain types of machines in the standard itself. So we need to be careful. But of course, again, I think this is something that is up to the technical bodies to discuss, while they define scope of standards, and also while they define the performance characteristics or safety elements they want to deal with within the standard. And of course, this also varies from sector to sector. And there is guidance from the different sectors at the moment that should be used in the drafting of the standard.
Okay, thank you, Gonzalo. We have a few questions left for the moment.
I could try to reply to the question from Anthony Karain, but I would perhaps also ask to clarify the question, because I think that we may be missing or we may be mixing 2 different elements. If you are saying whether you can refer to a standard that is used for presumption of conformity in a normative reference, I think this is actually a challenging question, because we are mixing 2 elements. So standards are prepared by CENELEC or CEN, if we expand to CEN and CENELEC and ISO and IEC. And once the standard is published, until the end of the DOW, the standard remains active in the catalog in CENELEC. However, there is a next step, is that these standards can be offered for citation, and then they may be able to provide presumption of conformity. So I would say that in line with the current guidance, we should only refer to standards that are active in the catalog, and more in the future, and the Commission is also highlighting these points, if the standard is not active in the catalog on the long run, they should not be providing presumption of conformity as such. But this is again, to be assessed and to be looked on a case-by-case basis. And there may be exceptions to this main principle, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Gonzalo. Is there anything else that you would like to reply, or can we close down the webinar here?
I can still try to reply to the last one. So
Okay.
how does the EU assess neutrality principles, and what are the legal implications if the standard doesn't follow the drafting principles? I think one of the purpose of today's webinar was also linked to some of the elements that the Commission has been highlighting in the assessment of standards offered for citation, which is that they don't follow sometimes the internal regulations. We try as much as possible as from the CCMC point of view to support technical bodies to draft standards in line with that. Of course, the interpretation of how IR3 are supposed to be handled in the drafting of the standards leaves a lot of space for interpretation and subjectivity. And in a way, so the Commission is trying to assess in that way as well, in terms of the normative references, as long as we don't give roles and permissions to parties involved in the use of a standard, especially when the legislation defining certain roles and tasks. So this is in a way how the Commission is also assessing. And of course, when they do reject standards for citation, we do get some impressions on what are the elements that they are looking at as such. And of course, there are also in the webinars and trainings that they have been providing all over the years, they always highlight that one of the critical points is following the internal regulations part 3 when drafting standard.
Okay, that makes sense indeed. Yes, there is one last question in the chat box, well, in the Q&A box, sorry. And I think that we will reply that last question and then we close down the webinar. So Frédéric, yes, please.
Thank you, El. So the question is about where to find information about the products that are relevant to the directives. I would say I will give a general answer. So the question was more about the low voltage directive. I would say that for any directive, be it low voltage, machinery, or EMC, the best is to go on the European Commission website where you can find the directive, and you will find there all the requirements of the directive. So the European Commission website would be the best source for information related to the requirements of the directives.
Okay, thank you, Frédéric.
Just one point, maybe, because it could be also, Frédéric, that the question is also looking into which kind of standard should be linked to the legislation. And then just to add on what you pointed out, Frédéric, would be that currently the basis for the preparation of harmonized standards is the standardization request. In the past, we had mandates, and those are, in most of the cases, the basis to start drafting harmonized standards. And more in the new standardization requests, you will have the list of standards or product groups that should be covered by the standardization request.
Okay, thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you, Marlies. Thank you, Frédéric, for this presentation. I think it was very interesting, and seeing the questions, I think the audience was also happy to have this webinar. So as I've said before, we're having a CEN webinar with a similar kind of information at 11:30. Should you want to join that, and you are of course welcome to join our upcoming webinars. So thank you for joining and wishing you a nice day. Bye-bye.